Congress continues debating the specifics of coronavirus relief legislation. Senators Josh Hawley and Mike Lee want to make sure lower-income families are not excluded from assistance.
Indeed. Joining us now via Skype for more on this is journalist Zaid Jilani. Great to see you, Zed. How are you doing?
Good to see you, Zed.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Let's just talk about the package that the Senate had proposed. Democrats voted it down. Do you think that was the right move for Democrats? What sort of things should they be pushing for in terms of the industry bailout piece?
Well, look, before they passed the tax cut package, the corporate tax cut package, I remember going down to Capitol Hill and interviewing a number of Republican lawmakers and talking to them about, what do you think the companies will do with this money? And a lot of them were very honest and said, well, we don't really know what they're going to do with it. We ended up seeing a lot of stock buybacks, a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And that's something that they've somewhat prohibited in this bill, although the language is considered to be quite weak. So that's really the question here is why are we doing this in the first place? I think we're doing it to support Americans at a time in need. And so we don't want companies using this funding to create a leaner workforce, to do more stock buybacks and to do mergers. We want them to use this money to keep people employed and keep people fed and also serve a customer base, particularly in the travel industry. So I think it's worth slowing down this legislation and looking at that very seriously.
And Zed, one of the things that we saw, too, is that there's general agreement whenever it comes to at least the one-time payment on the small business loans. We could even increase that somewhat in order to just basically give small businesses money. As long as they use it for payroll, they don't never have to pay it back. And yet the hang-up is over much of the corporate welfare, which is in the bill. And why is it being tied together? Is it an act of leverage by people who want to see this thing going on? What's happening here?
Yeah, I think McConnell does want to get this package through with these things tied together, because one thing they could do is separate out the unemployment insurance and also the direct cash payments from the rest of the bill, which is the small business loan program and the more targeted kind of aid to businesses. And I think by packaging it together, they're trying to get both sides who kind of have an interest in either thing to kind of get the votes together to do it without a whole lot of scrutiny. And I think that's something that Congress does quite a bit when you see these big controversial pieces of legislation. For instance, the TARP bill, the bank bailout, tied together a bunch of kind of social welfare spending that Democrats wanted because they needed to get the votes to actually get it through. So I think this is kind of a repeat of that maneuver, when really the wise thing to do would be to break the bill up and then take time on that second piece, the business piece, to get the regulations right while you're getting the direct cash aid more quickly to people.
I think that's right.
Right, that's exactly right. It's a point that Josh Barra made with us as well, which is that, look, what's urgent is the help to the people. Like the big companies, they're not going to go under tomorrow. You have some time there to think about who should get money and how they should get it and what strings should be attached and what should the provisions be. The thing that we need to focus on immediately is help to individuals and help to small businesses.
Yeah, and I think something else that should be considered that would kind of serve both purposes would be to, for instance, authorize the food stamps or the EBT program to be able to be used at restaurants, because a lot of restaurants are going under, like neighborhood restaurants right now. And if people could use their federal benefits to order delivery or takeout, it would be one way to keep them afloat. And then the people themselves would be choosing what's they're picking the winners and losers, right? It's not the federal government at that point. People are being empowered to do it. And I think that, creative ideas like that is what we should be talking about. But that should probably come after what we've thankfully all agreed on, which is these direct cash payments. I think Mitt Romney actually deserves a lot of credit for normalizing that idea on the Republican side, and then pushing that through. But again, I think that's a conversation we can start having immediately after we get that emergency aid through.
Right. And Zed, let's zoom out a little bit more. What does this kind of tell us about the sclerotic institutions that we have in America and the response to this crisis? It's funny, we cited one of your pieces that you wrote in the past about Larry Summers calling out people who are out for outsourcing Luddites and him asking, oh, how did this all happen in the first place? Just talk to us about what you see kind of as this has exposed about the economy and the political institutions amidst this crisis.
Look, I think a lot of somewhat positive things are happening in terms of political consensus around the world. For instance, Belgium formed an emergency government. They couldn't have a government for the past year because of disagreements. A number of things are happening in other places in the world. And here in the U.S., I think we're rethinking a lot of, particularly on the right, they're rethinking a lot of their kind of mottos and slogans. And I think that, the idea that it was totally okay to have all our medical supplies overseas in a country that's, goes through political turmoil or social turmoil with this virus, could use it even as a political weapon against us. That's something that people like Larry Summers never really thought about. I think that China's economy in early 2000s was like the size of Norway or smaller, or Italy or something. And now it's like basically a superpower, right? So I think this is a lot of things they didn't foresee. And I think that a lot of people who are champions of that kind of policy are being forced to rethink it by world events, just like the Republican Party was forced to rethink the payroll tax cut. Originally, they just wanted to use a tax cut to handle this. Eventually, they realized people who aren't on payroll won't benefit from a payroll tax cut.
Right.
So they had to do cash transfers instead. So I think, Summers is rethinking it. I think a lot of the Republicans are rethinking it. Maybe the Democrats are rethinking some of their belief on kind of travel restrictions. I didn't see a lot of people protesting when Trump put restrictions on Europe, which is now the epicenter of the outbreak. So I think a lot of people are being forced to rethink a lot of their priors in this moment, which is a healthy thing to do when there's a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point about the Democrats. I was very skeptical that there would be any rethinking going on on that side, but you're making a good point there. If you were advising Mnuchin or the other administration officials who are basically going to be deciding which industries get these bailouts, which companies survive and which don't, what sort of guidelines would you give them? How would you think about making those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, actually picking the companies themselves would be a difficult thing in terms of trying to do it in a fair way. But I think the conditions that you would put are very important. So, for instance, I think you'd have to make sure that companies are doing everything they can to keep their payroll intact, to provide sick leave for employees who are not benefiting from that benefit already, to make sure that basically any industry that you're helping it because they have a workforce and because they have kind of a necessitous kind of consumer role. Like, for instance, airlines, right? Airlines really didn't do anything wrong. It's just that people can't really travel right now because it's a very unsafe thing to do right now. So I think there will have to be some kind of support for airlines. But at the same time, we have to make sure those airlines don't take that money and use it to buy other airlines or use it to buy back their stocks, use it to cut down their workforce, use it to break unions or like the flight attendants and so on and so forth. So I think any kind of industrial policy we have, we should keep in mind that the ultimate goal of it is to benefit the American people and to maximize kind of the benefits for them. And we don't want this to be like a bad horror movie where we've seen it over and over. We know exactly what happens, which is unfortunately what happened with the TARP bailout, which is what happened with the tax repatriation holiday under President Bush, which is kind of what happened with the corporate tax cuts under Trump, is that we end up letting a lot of funding go to these companies, in this case, public money, and then they end up using it in ways that are against the public interest. So I think that's very, very important. This isn't a matter of social engineering. We're already giving them our money, right? We're just saying the money that we give you has to be used for us, right?
Right.
So.
And Zed, one interesting thing here, one of the problems I had with the bill, which is that it allows the government to take stock into private companies, but it doesn't allow them to exercise their voting rights as a result of the stock that they would get with that. What do you generally make of that position in terms of allowing the U.S. government to take stakes in these if we're going to have public interest, and then exercising the right of the public's voice in how those companies are run?
Right, and I think this is actually an idea that Dean Baker, an economist, and others have floated in the past, which is the idea that if we're basically acting as shareholders, we should go all the way, right? In terms of if you're a private individual and you're buying an interest in a company, the company has to respond to your shareholder interest as a matter of law. Normally, when the government ends up giving very good loan deals to companies or subsidies, they have no interest or power in kind of the shareholders or in equity. So they really don't have any power as to what happens with that. So I think that's a fair trade to make. Now, if a company wants to refuse that deal, if they want to say, we don't want the government aid, so, that's their right to do it. But I think at a time like this, a lot of them will want it. And, it's one way for us to at least guarantee some amount of accountability for the money we're giving out. This is an area where I think conservatives and liberals should agree that when public money is being handed out, we need to have some accountability with what is done with that money. It seems like that we again and again have offered large subsidies, whether it be to the for-profit college industry whether it be to the pharmaceutical industry with Medicare Part D, whether it is to the big agriculture with farm subsidies, where we kind of give away money and we don't have any accountability for it. And I think that offends conservative values and it offends the liberal values. So I think that's, at times like this, we need to finally get this right.
Yeah, I think that is so well said. And, also conceptually, if we're saying that these industries are essential to our nation, perhaps the public should have some say in how they're being run during this crisis and beyond. Zaid, it's so great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Zaid.
Yeah, thank you.
And we're going to have more Rising for you after this.